The ferry's horn groaned, a sound like a beast in pain, swallowed almost immediately by the dense, wet fog that clung to the water. Dean stood on the deck, hands gripping the cold, salt-encrusted rail, his gaze fixed on the indistinct smudge that was his destination. The air tasted of brine and decay, a fitting welcome, he thought, to the place where his grandfather had spent his final, solitary years. He was a cartographer, accustomed to the precise lines and predictable contours of maps, but this island, shrouded in its perpetual mist, felt like a deliberate erasure from any known chart. It was exactly what he needed, he told himself, a blank space, a place to lose himself, or perhaps, to finally find a different kind of peace. His own life, until recently, had been a series of careful calculations. Now, it was just a gaping void. He accepted the inheritance of the lighthouse keeper's cottage not out of sentimentality, but out of a desperate need for absolute removal. He wanted a place so remote, so forgotten, that the world he'd left behind couldn't possibly follow. The ferry shuddered, grinding against barnacled pilings. Through the swirling gray, a small, weather-beaten dock emerged, slick with seaweed. A lone figure, bundled in oilskins, stood waiting, his face obscured by the hood of his coat. The ferryman, Dean presumed. He felt a peculiar prickle of apprehension, not fear exactly, but the keen edge of stepping into the unknown, a sensation his meticulous profession rarely allowed. He was the only passenger to disembark. The ferryman, a man whose face was a road map of sun and wind, merely grunted as Dean shouldered his heavy duffel bag and a worn leather satchel filled with his most essential mapping tools. A few yards from the dock, a small, squat building sat hunched against the wind. This was the island's border checkpoint, a crude wooden structure with a single, grimy window. Inside, a customs agent, whose uniform looked several sizes too large, leafed through Dean's papers with a slow, deliberate rhythm. His eyes, the color of diluted seawater, scanned Dean's face with an unsettling intensity before returning to the documents. Inheritance, then, the customs agent stated, his voice flat, devoid of curiosity or welcome. Your grandfather was, Dean felt dismissed, an intruder tolerated rather than accepted. Outside the checkpoint, a rusted pickup truck waited, its engine idling with a wheezy cough. The ferryman, now behind the wheel, gestured curtly for Dean to climb in. The drive was a jarring affair. The track, barely more than a twin rut through the overgrown heather and gorse, wound steeply upwards. The fog thickened, pressing in on all sides, reducing visibility to a few feet. Then, through a sudden, momentary thinning of the mist, he saw it. The lighthouse, a stark, white sentinel, its top lost in the clouds, standing guard over a turbulent, unseen ocean. And nestled beside it, hunkered low to the ground, was the cottage. It was smaller than he'd imagined, and far more desolate. Its stone walls were streaked with salt and damp. The slate roof sagged in places, and several window panes were either cracked or entirely missing, boarded up with rough-hewn planks. It looked less like a home and more like a tombstone marking the edge of the world. The quiet that followed was profound, broken only by the distant, rhythmic crash of waves and the keening of the wind around the lighthouse. "Keys are under the mat," the ferryman said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't wait for a response, simply turned the truck around, and slowly, laboriously, began his descent back toward the dock, the fog swallowing him whole in moments. Dean stood alone in the swirling gray, the cottage looming before him. The air here felt different, heavy, laden with an unspoken history. He walked toward the cottage, his boots crunching on the gravel path. The front door, a heavy slab of weathered oak, creaked open with a groan that seemed to resonate through the entire structure. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp stone, mildew, and something else, a faint metallic tang like old copper left in the sea. Dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through the grimy windows. The rooms were small, sparsely furnished with heavy, utilitarian pieces. A map of the local coastline, hand-drawn and meticulously detailed, hung crookedly on one wall, its edges curled with age. Dean ran a hand over the rough, cold stone of the fireplace. His grandfather's presence, a spectral echo, felt almost palpable. He dropped his bags in what appeared to be the main living area, a space dominated by a large, scarred wooden table and a single, threadbare armchair. He walked to a window, wiping away a layer of grime with his sleeve, and peered out into the impenetrable fog. The ocean, though hidden, called to him with its ceaseless roar. He felt the profound isolation settle over him, heavy as a shroud. As he stood there, watching the gray nothingness, a sound reached him. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a low, resonant thrumming. It wasn't the wind, nor the waves. It felt deeper, like a vibration from beneath the earth or the deep ocean floor. He tilted his head, trying to pinpoint its origin, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a vibration in the very air he breathed. He held his breath, straining to hear it again, but it faded, leaving behind only the familiar symphony of wind and sea. He dismissed it as the old house settling, or perhaps the distant hum of the lighthouse generator. Yet, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He wasn't alone here, not truly. His grandfather's ghost lingered, and perhaps something else. He turned from the window, the faint thrumming an echo in his bones, the vast, indifferent ocean pressing in from all sides. He was here at the edge of the world, and the world felt like it was holding its breath. He watched as the ferry nudged against the barnacle sheath pilings of a skeletal dock, the impact jarring through the hull. A lone figure, a burly dock worker with a sou'wester hat pulled low over his eyes, emerged from the mist like a specter, securing the lines with practiced, weary movements. Dean disembarked, the wooden planks groaning beneath his boots. The fog was a living thing here, coiling around his ankles, muffling every sound until the ferry's receding churn was merely a phantom vibration in the damp air. He collected his few bags, the weight of them a familiar comfort against the unfamiliarity of his surroundings. A short walk along the uneven, shell-strewn path led him to a small, weathered shack marked with a faded sign, "Island Entry. Border checkpoint." Inside, a gaunt official, his face etched with the lines of wind and salt, barely glanced up from a ledger as Dean presented his identification. The man grunted, stamped a form with a heavy thud, and waved him through without a word, his eyes as gray and flat as the sea on an overcast day. The interaction was brief and sterile, yet it left Dean with a peculiar sense of being scrutinized, judged by the silent, ancient stones of the island itself. The cottage stood on a bluff, a squat, gray sentinel facing the relentless sweep of the ocean. It was smaller than he remembered from the old photographs, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the endless gray. The front door, salt-blasted and peeling, yielded with a protesting squeal. Dean set his bags down in the entryway, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. He moved through the rooms, each step raising a cloud of fine, gray powder. The furniture was draped in faded sheets, like sleeping giants. His grandfather's presence was a palpable weight, a ghost woven into the very fabric of the cottage. He ran a hand over a dust-laden mantelpiece, the grit clinging to his fingers. This was it, his new beginning, or perhaps just a continuation of the old, in a different, more desolate setting. As dusk began to bleed into the perpetual twilight of the fog, Dean started the arduous task of unpacking. He wanted to feel settled, to impose some order on the chaos that had become his life. Later, huddled by a sputtering fire he'd managed to coax to life, Dean noticed something odd. He checked his watch, then his grandfather's old tide charts found tacked to a wall in the kitchen. The water was behaving erratically, several hours off schedule. He dismissed it, initially, as a trick of the light, or perhaps the unique currents around this isolated island. He was new here, after all. He didn't know the sea's temper. At first, he thought it was the wind, whistling through a loose pane, or the creak of old timbers settling. A low, sibilant sigh that seemed to curl around the edges of his hearing, just beyond comprehension. It was too soft, too fleeting to grasp, like a half-remembered dream. He'd pause, straining his ears, but then it would vanish, leaving only the dull roar of the distant surf. He told himself it was the isolation, the sheer quiet after years of city noise, playing tricks on his mind. He was tired, grieving, perhaps a little unhinged. It was only natural. He spent the next day exploring the cottage more thoroughly, seeking a place for his own cartography equipment, a space to work. In his small, cramped study, tucked away behind a stack of nautical charts yellowed with age, he found it. A wooden sea chest, heavily water-damaged, its brass fittings corroded green. With a grunt, he pried it open. Inside, nestled among moth-eaten woolen blankets and a compass that no longer spun true, was a ledger. It was bound in thick, scarred leather, its pages swollen and rippled from exposure to water. This was his grandfather's journal. Dean's fingers trembled as he opened it. The ink had bled in places, blurring the neat script, but much of it was still legible. The early entries were mundane weather observations, supply lists, notes on lighthouse maintenance. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew frantic, erratic. The careful observations gave way to wild, feverish scrawls. He read phrases like, "It beckons and the pact holds, but it demands its due." What that? What did it demand? He always attributed it to old age, the loneliness of his profession. Now, a different, far more unsettling possibility began to take root. He slammed the journal shut, the sound sharp in the quiet room. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was madness. His grandfather, alone on this rock for decades, had clearly succumbed to the isolation, to the crushing weight of the sea and the sky. The journal was the rambling of a lonely old man, his mind unraveling. He had to believe that. He needed to believe that. He stood, journal clutched in his hand, and walked to the nearest window. The fog had thickened further, a solid, gray wall pressed against the glass. He couldn't see the water, but he could hear it. The cold knot in Dean's stomach persisted, a tangible weight beneath his ribs. The grandfather's journal lay open on the kitchen table, its brittle pages whispering of a world Dean had only ever considered fiction. It beckons, and the pact holds, but it demands its due. He traced the faded ink with a fingertip, a shiver running up his arm. He needed answers. This small island community, he knew, held its secrets close, but perhaps a forgotten archive, a dusty collection of local lore might offer some insight. The lighthouse beam swept past the window, a rhythmic pulse of artificial light against the encroaching natural gloom. The journey to the nearest town, a cluster of weather-beaten buildings on a larger neighboring island, involved a choppy ferry ride. Upon disembarking, he found himself at a small, unassuming structure marked simply as border checkpoint. A stern-faced customs officer, his uniform crisp despite the remote location, eyed Dean with a dispassionate gaze. "Purpose of visit?" the officer asked, his voice flat. "Research," Dean replied, trying to project an air of casual academic interest. "Local history," the officer merely grunted, stamping a form without a word before waving him through. The exchange left Dean feeling exposed, as if the official knew more than he let on, or perhaps simply saw a man on the edge. The town's public library was a quiet haven of aged wood and musty paper. Dean spent hours hunched over microfiche readers, his eyes burning as he scrolled through faded newspaper articles and local council minutes. Stories of the island's earliest settlers, of strange disappearances, of a place called the Sunken City, a mythical metropolis said to lie beneath the deepest waters surrounding the island. The legends spoke of an ancient, pre-human civilization, of colossal structures built from an unknown, obsidian-like material, and of rituals performed by desperate islanders seeking bountiful catches or protection from the unpredictable sea. They spoke of offerings, of a terrible price exacted for prosperity. One chapter detailed an annual sea gift ceremony, long abandoned, where objects of value were cast into a specific, unusually deep trench off the island's coast. Returning to the cottage, the journal's words now pulsed with a terrifying new clarity. "The pact holds, but it demands its due." It wasn't a metaphor, it was a contract, an agreement with something ancient and hungry. His grandfather hadn't just been reclusive. He had been guarding a secret, perhaps even upholding a terrifying obligation. That night, the dreams began. Vast, cyclopean structures loomed in the inky blackness, their surfaces slick and alien. It wasn't hostile, not exactly, but utterly, terrifyingly other. He felt its gaze, not on his body, but deep within the fragile architecture of his mind, probing, understanding. A slow, rhythmic thrumming vibrated through the water, a sound that wasn't sound, but a vibration that resonated in his bones. He awoke with a gasp, his skin clammy, the phantom thrumming still echoing in his skull. The first faint light of dawn barely pierced the fog. Dean swung his legs out of bed, his head pounding. He stumbled to the small, grimy bathroom, splashing cold water on his face. As he reached for a towel, his gaze caught on a patch of emerald green on the ceramic tiles around the old clawfoot tub. It wasn't mildew. This was a vibrant, almost luminescent growth, clinging to the grout lines and the porcelain, pulsing with a faint, internal light. He touched it tentatively. It felt slick, gelatinous, cool to the touch. He backed away slowly, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't just in the bathroom. In the kitchen, a similar glow emanated from the base of the sink, outlining the chipped enamel. A tendril of it snaked along the windowsill, a startling splash of unearthly color against the peeling paint. It was beautiful in a grotesque, unnatural way, a silent, creeping invasion. The bioluminescent algae, vibrant and alien, seemed to breathe with its own slow, measured rhythm, a physical manifestation of the entity's encroaching presence. The island was not just holding a secret. It was breathing it, and Dean, it seemed, was now inhaling its toxic air. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of unease. Dean found himself constantly listening, his ears straining against the roar of the wind and the ceaseless crash of waves. It began subtly. A porcelain mug, left on the edge of the counter, would be found inexplicably shifted inches inward. A book, placed carefully on a shelf, would lie askew, its spine angled away from the others. He initially dismissed these occurrences as his own absent-mindedness, the inevitable scatter of a mind preoccupied with grief and a growing list of unsettling discoveries. But the frequency escalated. He would turn his back for a moment, and a small, heavy brass compass, a family heirloom, would have rotated itself precisely 90 degrees on the mantelpiece. Then came the hum. It started as a low, almost subliminal thrum, like the distant vibration of a colossal engine, felt more in the bones than heard by the ear. It permeated the very fabric of the cottage, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards, through the stone walls, and into Dean's skull. It was hypnotic, a siren song of pressure and disorientation that made his teeth ache and his thoughts fray at the edges. He tried to block it out with music, but the hum seemed to weave itself into the melodies, distorting them, turning familiar notes into something alien and menacing. It was everywhere and nowhere. One morning, while shaving in the small, saw-pitted mirror above the wash basin, Dean paused, razor poised. His reflection stared back, but something was wrong. The lines of his face seemed to ripple, the contours of his jaw softening and then sharpening with an unnatural fluidity. He blinked hard, and the distortion vanished, leaving him staring at his own pale, unnerved face. The hum intensified, a constant companion that pushed Dean to the brink of his endurance. He meticulously combed through every inch of the cottage, driven by a frantic energy. Behind a loose stone in the hearth, he discovered a small, hidden recess. Inside, nestled among dried seaweed and a handful of oddly shaped, water-smooth pebbles, lay a collection of crude, hand-drawn maps. At the center of each map, where the lighthouse stood, a larger, more intricate symbol, almost like a gaping maw, had been drawn in a reddish-brown substance that Dean desperately hoped was rust. A small, desiccated fish, its eye sockets empty, lay beside them, wrapped in a brittle piece of linen. His grandfather hadn't just been observing. He'd been attempting to contain something to appease it. These rewards, perhaps even offerings. Later that afternoon, a biting wind drove rain against the cottage windows. Dean, needing to settle a minor customs issue for a package that had arrived for his grandfather, decided to make the trek to the small, official building at the island's only dock, the border checkpoint. The structure was a squat, gray concrete building, perpetually damp, smelling of old paper and brine. Inside, the clerk, a grizzled man with a perpetually tired expression, barely looked up as Dean explained his errand. The hum, however, was still with him, a low thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the very floor of the checkpoint, making the cheap, fluorescent lights flicker erratically. Dean felt a strange pressure in his ears, a growing sense of unease that was more acute here, away from the familiar stones of the cottage. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of stagnant water and something else, something metallic and ancient. In the sudden gloom, a shape coalesced in the far corner of the room, near a stack of crates. He couldn't move, couldn't even scream. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace that was utterly terrifying. Its presence was a suffocating weight, an ancient hunger. Then, with a sudden, jarring pop, the lights flickered back to life, bathing the room in their harsh, artificial glow. The clerk, who had been engrossed in a ledger, looked up, rubbing his eyes. Power flickered again. He grumbled, oblivious. Dean, heart hammering against his ribs, could only nod. His voice caught somewhere in his throat. He knew, with a certainty that froze him to the bone, that he had just come face to face with what his grandfather had fought, and had seen him. He leaned closer, the scent of aged paper and something else, a faint, briny decay, like a forgotten tide pool filling his nostrils. He turned a page, then another, his eyes scanning for repetition, for patterns. The entries grew more erratic, the dates less frequent. One entry, scrawled in a particularly agitated hand, caught his attention. The offering is not enough. It demands more. The cycles are shortening. The veil thins. Dean's breath hitched. Offering? What could his grandfather have been offering? The words swam before his eyes, blurring, then refocusing. It was subtle at first, barely a vibration, like a heavy ship's engine far out at sea. But it intensified, settling deep within his bones. He read on, piecing together fragments. His grandfather hadn't merely witnessed the entity. He had engaged with it. His grandfather hadn't been a victim, but a custodian, a participant in a terrible, forgotten covenant. He blinked hard, trying to clear his head, but the sensation persisted. He pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound was internal, a rising tide of dissonant frequencies. He flipped another page, and a small, brittle document, folded multiple times, slipped from between the leaves. He picked it up with trembling fingers. It was an old, official-looking travel permit, water-stained and faded, with a thick, ominous stamp. The destination was listed simply as Isle of the Water, and near the bottom, barely legible, was a date and the printed word, border checkpoint. A border checkpoint for a remote island lighthouse? It implied a level of official control, a deliberate isolation that went far beyond typical maritime regulations. Had his grandfather needed special clearance to come here, not just to tend a light, but to oversee something else? He imagined his grandfather, grim-faced, presenting this at some desolate mainland quay, crossing a threshold not just geographic, but existential. The hum intensified, becoming a piercing drone. The air in the cottage grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The kitchen walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with the rhythm of the sound. His gaze fell upon a sketch in the journal, one he hadn't noticed before. It was a crude drawing of the lighthouse's base, but with an arrow pointing downwards towards an obscured section. He made his way to the lighthouse, the hum growing to a roaring crescendo in his head. The stone walls felt slick beneath his fingertips, covered in a thin film of moisture. At the very bottom, where the spiral ended in a small, circular antechamber, the air was utterly still. He swept his gaze around, his heart thudding against his ribs. There was no obvious door, no visible opening. A large, rusted iron ring, almost flush with the stone, was set into its center. It was heavy, encrusted with salt and years of disuse. With a grunt, he pulled. The stone groaned, a low, grinding protest, and slowly, agonizingly, began to lift. A rush of frigid, stagnant air carrying the scent of ancient earth and something profoundly alien billowed upwards. This wasn't merely a cellar. This was a crypt, and Dean knew, with a certainty that stole his breath, that his grandfather's pact, and whatever lay dormant beneath the waves, was far more terrible than he could have ever imagined. The deep song had ceased to be a mere sound. It was a current, pulling at the very fibers of Dean's being, a cold, insistent tug towards the island's interior. He moved with a strange, dissociative purpose, his mind a hollow echo chamber for the insistent thrumming. The scraping of the chair had been a punctuation mark, a final declaration. He had to go! The air outside the cottage was thick with salt and an unfamiliar, cloying sweetness that made the back of his throat ache. The fog, a constant companion, clung to the gnarled trees, transforming them into skeletal sentinels. The vegetation grew denser here, thorns tearing at his jacket, wet leaves slapping against his face. He pushed through, driven by an instinct that was no longer entirely his own. This was the border checkpoint. It was a relic, a brutalist scar on the landscape, built perhaps for a time when the island was less remote, less forgotten. A rusted, half-shattered boom barrier lay twisted on the ground, its paint flaking like diseased skin. A small, windowless hut leaned precariously, its single steel door hanging ajar, groaning on a corroded hinge. The air around it was heady, suffocating as if the very atoms held their breath. He stepped through the threshold of the hut, the door scraping a protest that echoed in the confined space. Inside, dust motes danced in slivers of weak light that penetrated cracks in the ceiling. The deep song intensified, vibrating in his teeth, his bones. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, Dean began his descent. Each rung creaked under his weight, a fragile protest against his intrusion. The tunnel twisted, descended further, until he could no longer see the faint light from above. Then, the tunnel opened. He stood on a narrow ledge overlooking a vast, cavernous chamber, so immense his flashlight beam was swallowed before it could touch the far walls. Below him, at the heart of the chamber, was the source of the deep song. It was not an artifact in the conventional sense, not something forged or carved. It resembled nothing he had ever seen, yet felt utterly ancient, primordial. It was a sphere, perhaps 20 feet in diameter, composed of obsidian dark water that defied gravity, swirling and coalescing into impossible shapes. Within its depths, faint phosphorescent veins pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, like the heart of a submerged leviathan. The deep song emanated directly from it, a silent scream that tore at the fabric of his sanity. As he watched, mesmerized and horrified, the surface of the aqueous sphere rippled, and images began to form within its depths. They were not clear, distinct pictures, but impressions, feelings, a flood of unfiltered information that crashed into Dean's mind, bypassing his eyes, his ears, his logic. He saw, or rather felt, the identity. It was not a single creature, but a vast consciousness and intelligence that had existed before the first star ignited, slumbering in the unimaginable pressure and blackness beneath the world. He witnessed its intentions. The island, once a sanctuary, was merely a gateway. He saw the sea itself, no longer a vast expanse of water, but a living, breathing extension of the entity, its currents and tides merely the slow, deliberate movements of an unfathomably vast organism. And then, the vision sharpened, focusing on him. The deep song became a deafening roar inside his skull, a cacophony of ancient hunger and unimaginable power. His knees buckled. He clutched at the slimy rock of the ledge, his knuckles white. The vision, the entity, was not merely threatening the island, it was threatening reality itself. The scraping of the chair had barely registered as he'd risen, his limbs heavy, his vision blurred at the edges. Now, each step felt less his own, more an involuntary compliance with an unseen, unheard command. It was not just a suggestion, not merely an influence, but a deliberate, invasive entry. He felt his own memories, the sharp, painful edges of his grief being prodded, distorted. A flicker of his wife's face, then it was twisted into something grotesque, alien. He stumbled, catching himself on the rough bark of a wind-stunted pine. He could feel it now, The entity, not just outside, but inside, exploring the pathways of his mind, testing the walls of his identity. Though a desperate, fractured thought clawed its way to the surface, he would not yield. His own will, battered and bruised, flared with a dying ember of defiance. He pushed back, a futile, silent scream against the intrusive presence. The effort was immense, like trying to stem a tidal wave with his bare hands. He needed the journal, his grandfather's erratic scrawlings, his desperate warnings. They were the only weapons he had. He turned, the motion clumsy, his body still sluggishly responding to the deep song's pull, but now also fighting it. He burst into the cottage, the door slamming against the frame with a thud that echoed in the sudden, relative quiet. He scrambled to the writing desk, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped the heavy, leather-bound book. He flipped through the brittle pages, his gaze darting across the cramped script, the faded ink. His grandfather had been meticulous, even in his madness, documenting everything. Diagrams of strange symbols, astronomical charts that made no sense, fragmented notes about the hunger and the sleeping giant. He passed over sections detailing the lighthouse's operation, old weather reports, desperate pleas for help. He needed something specific, something about stopping it. Then his fingers brushed against a section near the back, hastily written, almost illegible. The heading, scrawled in thick, desperate strokes, read, "The binding at the border." Dean's breath hitched. He scanned the words, his mind struggling to process the archaic language, the cryptic references. His memories, his sati, his being, it craved his surrender, but cannot take implied something it was denied, something it needed to be given willingly. Its stone walls remembered the ancient sacrifices. Dean remembered seeing a crumbling, squat stone structure on the northern tip of the island, half swallowed by the encroaching moss and sea spray. He'd always assumed it was an old customs house, long abandoned, but the grandfather's words imbued it with a new, terrifying significance. The text continued detailing a series of intricate symbols to be etched, an incantation to be spoken, and then the sacrifice. A life given, not taken, but chosen. A piece of the self, offered to bridge the divide. A piece of the self, Dean's mind reeled. His grief, his lingering hope, his love for his lost wife, the very thing that had brought him to this desolate place. Could he offer that? The thought was a fresh wound, raw and agonizing, to willingly give up the last vestiges of what connected him to her, to sacrifice the very essence of his sorrow, the pain that kept her memory alive. It was a price too terrible to contemplate. Yet, the entity was already inside him gnawing. What was left to lose? A sudden, sharp crack resonated from the floorboards below, followed by a low, guttural growl that vibrated to the very timbers of the cottage. The deep song intensified, now a frantic drumming against his skull. The entity was no longer content with mere infiltration. It was actively trying to force its way in, to shatter the last remnants of his will. The cottage groaned, the windows rattling violently as if an invisible fist were pounding against the glass. The choice was stark, terrifying. The old border checkpoint loomed in his mind, a final, grim stage for a ritual he barely understood, a sacrifice that would tear him apart. He had to. He had nothing left to lose but himself, and perhaps that was exactly what the entity craved. The island was no longer a place of quiet solitude. It had become a living, groaning throat. It coiled around the cottage, not drifting, but seeping, infiltrating every crack and crevice, blurring the edges of the world until Dean felt he was moving through a waking dream. The air itself thrummed with a low, resonant hum, a sound that vibrated not in his ears, but in the marrow of his bones. Out beyond the windows, the sea was a chaotic churn of slate gray and sickly green, waves crashing against the cliffs with a furious, hungry roar. But it wasn't just the weather. The very landscape had begun to distort. The gnarled trees that clung to the rocky slopes now seemed to writhe, their branches like bony, grasping fingers, their bark weeping a viscous, dark sap that smelled of iodine and decay. Strange, luminous fungi, the color of bruised flesh, bloomed in impossible places, pulsing with a faint internal light. Every shadow seemed to stretch and deepen, holding within it the promise of unseen movement. Dean gripped the tattered journal, its leather cover slick with condensation despite being indoors. He had read the final pages again and again, the faded script burning itself into his memory. The counter-ritual, the binding, the sacrifice. The journal spoke of a nexus point, a place where the veil between worlds thinned to a mere membrane. The cost, the journal warned, would be profound. The thought was a searing brand, but underneath the agony, a strange clarity had settled. There was no other way. He ran a thumb over the photograph tucked into the journal's last page. Her smile, her eyes, vibrant and full of life. This was the conduit, not the photograph itself, but everything it represented, everything he had been to him, the very foundation of his being since her loss. The entity craved the purest anguish, the deepest attachment. It sought to consume not just his body, but his soul's deepest wellspring. He packed a few essentials, a lantern, a coil of rope, a small, rusted iron knife mentioned in the journal for a symbolic cut, not of flesh but of severance. He knew the way to the nexus point, a forgotten shrine his grandfather had once mentioned, nestled in a particularly isolated cove on the far side of the island. The journey would be arduous, a final gauntlet. Stepping out of the cottage, the world assaulted his senses. The ground beneath his boots felt spongy, the earth itself yielding as if softened by rot. His path led him along a crumbling cliff edge, the wind whipping at him with malevolent force. The fog swirled, momentarily parting to reveal brief, horrifying glimpses, a rock formation that mimicked the gaping maw, a cluster of seabirds clinging to a slick, black outcropping, their feathers matted, their eyes milky and unseeing. He pressed on, his gaze fixed on the faint, pulsating glow in the distance that marked the direction of the shrine. The journal had warned that the entity's presence would distort and confuse, twisting familiar landmarks into monstrous parodies. He relied on instinct, on the deep, ancestral pull that seemed to guide him through the encroaching madness. After what felt like an eternity, through a landscape that shifted and warped with every step, he saw it. An ancient, weathered stone archway, once perhaps a ceremonial entrance to the shrine, now stood warped and overgrown. Barnacles, unnaturally large and razor-sharp, encrusted its sides, glistening with an oily sheen. This was the border checkpoint, a threshold, physical and metaphysical, between the familiar world and the entity's encroaching domain. Through it, the world twisted further, the very light appearing dimmer, swallowed by the suffocating gloom. He hesitated for a single agonizing moment, the image of his wife's face flashing behind his eyes, a phantom pain in his chest. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, Dean pushed through the clinging seaweed, stepped beneath the jagged arch, and crossed the border. There was no turning back. The counter-ritual awaited. It coiled around the cottage, not drifting, but seeping, infusing every fiber of the air with its chilling essence. Dean moved with a grim determination that felt both alien and essential. The lighthouse, a spectral finger against the impenetrable gray, called to him, a beacon of purpose in the unraveling world. He clutched the heavy, barnacle-encrusted key, its cold metal a tangible anchor in the swirling unreality. Each step toward the lighthouse was a battle against the encroaching chaos. The ground under his boots felt less like solid earth and more like a vast, flexing membrane. Sounds were distorted, stretched thin and then compressed. The roar of the ocean a distant, guttural rumble beneath the closer, wet, sucking noises that seemed to rise from the very stones. He could feel eyes on him, not physical eyes, but a pressure, a vast, cold awareness that permeated the fog, an entity observing its prey. He navigated the winding, treacherous path, the wind whipping his coat, trying to tear his resolve to shreds. It was an old, crumbling stone archway, flanked by two derelict, roofless shacks that had once, perhaps, served as a gatehouse. This was it, the island's forgotten border checkpoint, not a place for customs or passports, but a threshold where reality frayed, where the familiar gave way to the unspeakable. The archway groaned, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated in his chest as if the very stone was in agony. Beyond it, the air shimmered, the fog pulsing with an inner light, a bioluminescent haze that suggested vast, unseen movements within its depths. The pressure intensified, a physical weight pressing down on his skull, making his teeth ache. "You are alone. You are lost. You are nothing." He clenched his jaw, the taste of copper suddenly sharp on his tongue. He would not yield. He had come too far. He pushed open the heavy, salt-bitted door, the shriek of his hinges echoing like a dying cry. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the smell of mold and something else. The same ancient metallic tang of the fog, but concentrated, suffocating. It was trying to break him, to unravel his mind before he could reach the apex. He saw faces, heard voices, distorted, accusing. "This is your fault. You brought this here." He gripped the key tighter, his knuckles white. He knew these were illusions, projected by the thing in the deep, designed to shatter his focus, to drown him in his own grief. He pushed through, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his vision blurring at the edges. The lighthouse's interior began to rise. Finally, he reached the lantern room. The glass panes, once clear, were now obscured by a slimy film, and beyond them, the fog pulsed with an unholy radiance. This was the entity's true manifestation, its anchor in his reality. Dean felt a primal scream rising in his throat, but he swallowed it. He produced the strange, carved stone he had found, its surface cool and smooth beneath his trembling fingers. The ritual. It was a desperate gamble, a pact with forces he barely understood, but it was the only way. He began to chant the words his grandfather had scrawled in the forgotten journal, a language that felt like grit and broken glass in his mouth. As he spoke, the tendrils lashed out, not physically touching him, but striking at his mind, his memories. The vortex pulsed, growing wider, the pressure in the room becoming unbearable. The images intensified, his wife's face, serene in death, then twisted into a monstrous visage, her eyes black pits. "Join me, Dean, let go." The ritual required more than just words, more than just the stone. A sacrifice, not his life, not his sanity, but something deeper, something vital. The source of his connection, his ability to perceive the island's truths, his cartographer's eye, his ability to see the hidden lines, the lay paths, the truth beneath the surface. That was the price. To seal the portal, he would have to sacrifice the very thing that had led him to this knowledge. With a ragged breath, a silent scream of defiance and acceptance, Dean pressed the carved stone against his chest, directly over his heart, and focused all his will, all his grief, all his terrifying understanding of the island onto the map in his pocket. He felt a searing pain. Not physical, but an internal rending, as if a part of his soul was being torn away. He poured his essence, his unique perception, into the ritual, into the ancient words. The vortex shrieked, a sound that flayed his ears and began to contract. The tendrils recoiled, thrashing wildly. The lighthouse groaned, the glass panes of the lantern room cracking with sharp reports. The ritual consumed him, but it worked. The vortex shrank, coalescing into a pinpoint of blackness, then vanished, leaving behind only the swirling, thick fog outside the shattered glass. He stood there, swaying, the carved stone now dull and inert in his hand. The lighthouse was silent, save for the moan of the wind through the broken panes. The entity was gone, or at least, sealed away. What the cost, he felt it acutely. The world seemed flat, devoid of the intricate, hidden patterns he had once perceived. The island, once a tapestry of mystery, was now just rock and earth. The profound, personal sacrifice had been made. A cold, agonizing sensation spread through his chest, a realization that solidified into certainty. A sacrifice, the source of his connection to the living world, the last vestiges of his sorrow, the very core of his profound personal tragedy. It was the wellspring from which his grief flowed, the raw, aching wound that had driven him to this desolate place. He understood now. He had to offer the cold, empty space where his heart once held love and loss. The incessant, rhythmic drone from beneath the waves, a sound that had become the very pulse of his existence, softened, retreating to a faint, distant thrum. He had done it. He had offered the only thing left that held true value to him, the pain that defined his recent years. The cost was immediate, palpable. He felt clean. Not clean in the sense of purity, but scoured. Empty. The crushing weight of his personal loss, the grief that had been his constant companion, was gone, wiped away as if it had never been. In its place, a vast, quiet chasm. He looked at his hands, calloused from his cartography, from gripping the rough stone of the lighthouse. They felt alien, detached. He could remember the faces of those he had lost, the sound of their laughter, the warmth of their touch, but the memory carried no sting, no pang of longing. It was like recalling a distant dream, beautiful but utterly devoid of emotional resonance. This was the resolution. The deep song had retreated, its encroaching tendrils of madness pulled back from the island's shores, but it had taken his humanity as payment. He was no longer Dean, the grieving cartographer neutral, an observer. The next few days passed in a blur of dispassionate action. He packed his few belongings, his maps, his instruments. Each item he touched, each corner of the cottage he glanced at, held memories he could access but no longer feel. The salt-crusted windows, through which he had watched countless fog banks roll in, were just panes of glass. He left the island on the small, sputtering ferry that made its weekly run to the mainland, carrying only a canvas bag and the profound emptiness inside him. The other passengers, a few weathered fishermen and a supplier, seemed impossibly vibrant, their voices too loud, their laughter too bright. He saw their expressions, their camaraderie, their small worries and joys, and understood them intellectually, but felt no connection, no desire to join their world. The island, receding behind him into the perpetual mist, seemed to sigh in relief. Or perhaps it was merely the wind. His journey inland was a long, silent odyssey. He moved through towns and cities, their bustling streets and neon glow a stark contrast to the island's desolate beauty. He bought food, paid for lodging, interacted with vendors and clerks, all with a calm, unnerving efficiency. He noticed the way people looked at him, the slight hesitation in their gaze, the quick glance away. He knew why. Weeks later, he found himself at a border checkpoint, a low, utilitarian building nestled between two towering cliffs that marked the passage into another region. A uniformed official, a man with a neatly trimmed beard and eyes that had seen too many weary travelers, beckoned him forward. "Papers, please," the official said, his voice a low rumble. Dean produced his identification, his movements precise, unhurried. The official scrutinized the documents, then Dean's face. His gaze lingered, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Dean met it without flinching, without emotion. He felt no unease, no impatience, only a quiet observation of the official's subtle reactions. Reason for travel? The official asked, his voice now laced with a hint of suspicion. He tapped the pen against the laminated card. Dean paused. What was his reason? To escape? To find a new life? He had no such motivations. He simply was asterisk. The island, the entity, had stripped him of purpose, of leaving only existence. Seeking, he felt no need for quiet now, nor for noise. He felt nothing. The official's brow furrowed slightly. He glanced at a screen beside him, then back at Dean. You've been on the island for some time. According to this, yes? Remote place. Not many come back from there. Not like this. The official's eyes flickered across Dean's face again, searching, assessing. Dean knew what he was looking for, the signs of a breakdown, the telltale tremors of a person unspooled by solitude or hardship. But there was nothing to find. His face was a placid mask. I'm fine, Dean offered, his voice level, devoid of any inflection that might betray a lie or a truth. He was not fine. He was something else entirely. He was the aftermath. The official sighed, a sound of weary resignation. He stamped Dean's papers with a decisive thud. All right, you can proceed. He handed the documents back, his fingers brushing Dean's. Dean felt the warmth of the official's skin, noted the slight tremor in his hand, the subtle scent of antiseptic from the soap. He registered it all, like data. Dean walked through the checkpoint, past the metal barriers and the watchful eyes of another uniformed guard. The world stretched out before him, vast and indifferent. He carried no hope, no fear, no joy, no sorrow. The deep psalm was quiet. For now, he was a vessel, a living archive of a horror he could no longer feel, but could never forget. The immediate threat was neutralized, but Dean was a monument to its terrible cost, forever changed, an empty shell walking among the living, carrying the burden of an unspoken truth. The future was not uncertain, it was simply endless.